1 year after Metroid Prime 2 released, the next generation of consoles started. 720p and really bad frame rates. At least a lot of games during that time had pretty bad frame rates. But the GameCube already had some great looking games, so I can only imagine what the next Zelda or Mario game will look like with more powerful hardware. Well, at least there's widescreen. In 2007, Metroid Prime 3 would be released, and it's kind of a divisive entry in the series, at least within the fan base. While I've never seen anybody say it's a bad game, I have heard some say it's the worst or least interesting game in the Prime series. But I've also heard some say it's just as good as the others. In the last Metroid video, I ended that video by saying I never finished Prime 3. And that's kinda weird because it was the first Metroid game I ever bought and played. So one day during a summer, I went to a garage sale and they were selling some games they had. I saw a stack of Wii games and in the middle of the pile was Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. I heard a lot of good things about the series, so I bought it alongside Mario Kart for $5. It's so weird to think back to a time where I pretty much knew nothing about Metroid. The only thing I knew about the series was the main character's name was Samus and he was in Smash Bros. Yeah, I didn't even know Samus was a woman at the time. Anyway, when I got home, I immediately put Prime 3 in, and I was excited to see for myself why these games were beloved by so many people. I stopped playing it a bit after the fight with Ridley. I don't remember why I specifically stopped playing. The only thing I remember is it reminded me of Halo. I love Halo, but for a series that was praised by so many people, I was expecting it to stand out a bit more, and I haven't played it since. That was a while ago though, so maybe now that I'm a fan of the series and have more context about the story in the Prime games, I'll be more invested in this game than I was back then. Well, there's only one way to find out, so let's get into it. Well, maybe that's why it reminds me of Halo. The song that plays on the title screen sounds like it's from Halo. Samus gets a message from the Galactic Federation. They say the commander wants to have a meeting with her and a few other bounty hunters. When the meeting starts, the commander first introduces them to the Aurora unit. When I first played this game years ago, I didn't think much about this, but now that I've played pretty much every game in the series, the Aurora unit kinda looks like Mother Brain. I wonder if that's going to be brought up in the plot. Anyway, the Aurora unit is an organic supercomputer, and there are a few of them on different planets. The network for the units were shut down a few days before the game takes place because there was a phazon virus that affected all the units. They believe the virus came from the space pirates because of course they do. Some scientists at the Galactic Federation were able to make a vaccine for the units, but the virus has already spread to other living things. Then, before they can get more information, the space pirates attack the Federation ships. So after helping the Federation fight back against the pirates, Samus goes back to her ship so she can fly to the Federation's base on the planet Norian. After playing through this intro again, I see why it reminded me of Halo. After the meeting is interrupted, the intro turns into an action-packed escape where you blast through enemies. There are some puzzles, but other than that, this just feels like an intro to a first-person shooter more than a Metroid game. If Prime 1 had an intro like this, the fans who were hating on the game before launch probably would have stopped playing and assumed that they were right about the game. Now I know I said that Prime 1's intro is an exciting prologue, and that by the end there is some action, but that intro still feels like Metroid to me. To be fair, that intro takes most of its beats from Super Metroid. Arrive on space station, see something's wrong, Ridley, and then escape. I think the reason why this intro doesn't feel like Metroid to me is because it lacks a feeling of isolation. Ever since the first Metroid game, it was always just Samus alone with no friendly creatures, exploring an unknown area. Well, at least unknown to the player. Even in games like Fusion, Dread, or Prime 2, where you can talk to AI Adam or Umos, you're still pretty much alone because you can only talk to Adam in save rooms and he's an AI, not actually there. And Umos was only at the Great Temple. While I don't think this intro feels like Metroid, and it is my personal least favorite intro in the Prime series, there are things I do like about this intro. First, I like seeing and learning more about the Galactic Federation. I thought it was cool to see the types of tech they use and see other bounty hunters they hire. I also think it's a good tutorial. It does a good job at getting players used to the new controls in this game. Like I kinda mentioned earlier in the video, about a year after Prime 2 released, the next generation of consoles started. Microsoft released the Xbox 360 and Sony released the PlayStation 3. But Nintendo always experimented with their consoles. So for this generation, they released the Nintendo Wii. The main gimmick was motion controls. When I talked about Prime 1, I briefly mentioned the control scheme for the Wii release of that game. Those controls were originally made for Metroid Prime 3, and they work incredibly well in this game. Pointing where I wanted to shoot or interacting with things in Samus' ship all worked great. When I was younger, I remember I didn't really like motion controls, because the games I tried that had them implemented them pretty poorly. Now if they're implemented well, I don't really mind them honestly. Other than needing to point the Wii remote or turn it, the controls aren't much different than the GameCube ones. The few changes they made I actually think make the combat more interesting than in the previous entries. Not by much, but still. One of the first upgrades you get in this game is the grapple lasso, and not too long after, it gets upgraded to the grapple beam. You use it by moving the nunchuck towards the screen. The grapple beam is still used to swing over pits, until you get the screw attack. But you can now use it to rip shields away from enemies. My favorite fights to use the grapple beam were the boss fights that used it. Like the Korok, I don't know if that's how you say it. You use bombs to hit it, then grapple the back to reveal its weak spot. The other new addition to the combat is Hyper Mode. So when Samus and the other bounty hunters are in the control room at the Federation's base, they are attacked by Dark Samus. The game cuts to 1 month later when Samus wakes up. Her body now generates Phazon, and the people who repaired her suit put a Phazon enhancement device in it. This device gives Samus' arm cannon more power by using the Phazon, at the cost of some health, specifically 1 energy tank. You can also use it in Morph Ball form once you get the right upgrade. I love the concept of Hyper Mode, risk versus reward. I said I like the concept of it because I think this game is too easy for it to ever be a risk. I never got a game over during my playthrough of Prime 3, which surprised me because like I said, I never finished this game before. Everything after Norian was new to me. For this playthrough, I played the game on normal mode. Maybe it's more of a risk versus reward system on Hyper Mode, but actually, you know what? I'm going to replay the game on Hyper Mode. So I just finished playing the game again on Hyper Mode, and I will say I thought the combat was a little better, but not by much. Using Hyper Mode was actually more of a risk, because like I said, it uses an energy tank. I also found the bosses way more fun to fight because they would kill me in just a few hits. I think whenever I replay this game, I'm going to play it on Hyper Mode. I like that Echoes was harder than the first game, and while I don't think Hyper Mode made Prime 3 as hard as some parts in Echoes, I personally really enjoyed the added difficulty. But when playing on normal mode, I think the game is too easy. Enemies go down really fast. Even some bosses can be defeated really quickly. I guess I would rather have the bosses die quickly than take forever like some of the ones in the first Prime game. Also, for the first time in the Prime series, in Corruption, beam types stack. In the first 2 Prime games, to switch beams you had to push the C-stick in the direction of whatever beam you wanted, if you were playing the GameCube versions. Obviously, the Wii Remote and Nunchuck don't have a second analog stick, so they just stack in this game. The 2 beams you collect in this game are the Plasma Beam and the Nova Beam. The Plasma Beam can melt certain objects and burn enemies, and the Nova Beam can shoot through Phazon walls. Missiles also get a new upgrade. Instead of super missiles like the other games, Corruption turns them into ice missiles, so like Fusion did. While I think the combat in Corruption is better than it was in the 2 previous games, I don't think the exploration was as good as theirs. When you're just going to where you have to go to progress, I think it's fine. There are some fun puzzles to do either to progress or collect an item, but a lot of items weren't satisfying to collect because it felt like there were a lot more of them that were just sitting out in the open compared to the 2 previous games. In the first 2 Prime games, there were some missile expansions and energy tanks that were just laying out in the open. But in Corruption, there was a lot more of that. I don't know if that was just me though. If I had to guess the reason why the beginning of the game makes collecting energy tanks really easy, it's probably because Hyper Mode uses an energy tank of health. This game is also much more linear compared to the first 2 Prime games. Now, technically every Metroid game is linear. There's a set path that the developers expect the player to go on. It's just some games let you sequence break so you can get something or do something earlier than you're supposed to do. And even when there are sequence breaks, most of the time the developers knew you could do that, like going to Ridley before Kraid in Zero Mission, or getting the gravity suit early in Dread. But in Prime 3, it being linear is so much more noticeable because the game often tells you where to go. Even if you turn the hint system off, it still tells you where to go, it just doesn't show you where to go on the map. I'm assuming the reason why this game tells you where to go so much, more often than the previous titles, is it's probably because this game was released on the Wii. The Wii was advertised as a console that anyone could play, so they probably wanted to make sure no one would get lost, to make sure this game was accessible for everyone. I mean, I guess if you've never played a Metroid game before, this could be a good game to start with, at least when it comes to gameplay. Anyway, the last reason why I don't like exploring in this game as much as the others is because, and this is just a nitpick, but the doors in this game took way longer to open than they did in the 2 previous games. Even in the GameCube version of Prime 1. This is something I never really mentioned in the other videos, but from what I understand, when you get close to a door, the game starts loading in the room on the other side. So when you get to the door, you can go through it and the game will unload the previous area. It's really impressive that these games never cut to a loading screen. But sometimes doors would take longer to open because the room hasn't fully loaded in yet. This rarely happened to me in the first 2 games. In Prime 3 though, I was waiting for doors to open way more. I'm assuming this game was pushing the Wii's hardware to its limits. Visually, this game looks great for a Wii title. When I got to Skytown, I was actually impressed. It looks great, and I'm not sure if an area like this would be possible on the GameCube. Sadly, while I love the visuals of this area, I think it might be my least favorite area to go through. I already mentioned the doors taking a while to open, which happens a few times on every planet in this game. But another reason why I didn't enjoy this planet was because of these zipline things. The first time you use them, it's okay, but going for all the items in this area means you have to use them a lot, and it just gets kind of boring. Eventually, you can use cannons to launch Samus from one side to another so you don't have to use them. Other than Planet Elysia, I thought everywhere else was pretty good. And like I said, I don't even think Elysia is that bad. Just like Prime 2, I'm glad they don't make you go from area to area as much as the first game, especially since there are different planets this time. And the loading screen when you're flying to another planet takes quite a while. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, Samus' ship gets way more attention in this game than it did in the 2 previous entries. In Prime 1, it just kinda sat there and was pretty much a save point that restored health and ammo. And in Echoes, it was damaged for the majority of the game. In Corruption though, you can interact with things inside it, You don't really need to, other than when you have to go to another planet. It even gets its own upgrades in this game. They're usually only useful for the planet you got the upgrade on, or if the upgrade is used on multiple planets, it's only used a few times. Like the grapple, which is pretty much only used on Elysia. The missiles are used a bit more. You can destroy things that are made out of meldium. I wish they did a bit more with the ship, maybe have a few more puzzles that involved it, but it's fine. The worst part about the ship is the long loading screens you have to sit through when you fly to another planet. Seriously, thankfully they don't make you go back and forth between planets that often. So just like the other Metroid Prime videos, before I talk about the final boss and the end of the game, we have to talk about the endgame fetch quest that all the Prime games have. Prime 1 had the Chozo artifacts. When I started that game, I expected it to be the worst part of it, but as I found out during my playthrough, you can get quite a bit of them before needing them to progress. Echoes had the Sky Temple keys. While you can't get as many of them before you need all of them, I thought collecting all of them was better than getting all the Chozo artifacts, because the light suit lets you fast travel to each area of the game, while fast travel to each temple. And even though you can't fast travel, I think the search for the energy cells and corruption is the best endgame hunt in the Prime series. I would still prefer not to have one at all because I think it ruins the pace of the end of the game, especially in the first two games, but Prime 3 does it the best in the trilogy, in my opinion. In total there are 9 energy cells, but you only need to collect 5 to get to the area on the Valhalla with the pirate code in it. The other 4 unlock rooms that have energy tanks and missile expansions. During this playthrough, since it was my first time I ever finished this game, I didn't know which rooms I needed to use the energy cells in, so I ended up getting the extra pickups and then needing to go back to get the other cells. But if I had known which rooms I needed to use them in, I wouldn't have had to backtrack at the end of the game at all. Throughout the game you find enough of the cells so you don't have to do any backtracking. You only have to backtrack for the rest if you're going for 100% completion, which I never really do in Metroid games other than Super and sometimes Dread. Anyway, once you get the pirate code, you have to go to the Leviathan. The Leviathan makes a wormhole to planet Phase, which is where all the Phazon came from. When Samus lands on Phase, her body becomes completely corrupted by the Phazon. So for the rest of the game, you're always in hyper mode. Now, slowly over time, or when you take damage, your Phazon level raises. And if the bar on top of the screen completely fills up, it's game over. After going through a few rooms, you run into Dark Samus, who is really easy. But then it's time for the real final boss, the Aurora unit. This fight still isn't that challenging, but it's better than the previous one with Dark Samus. For the first phase of the fight, you have to shoot it for a bit so you can knock it down, then use the grapple beam to reveal its weak spot. During the second phase, it just flies around and you have to hit the back of it to do damage. After the unit is defeated, the Phazon is removed from Samus' body, and Planet Phase explodes. Thankfully, the Galactic Federation was able to use the Leviathan to make another wormhole so they could escape. After they do, they say they lost contact with Samus, but obviously she doesn't die. Right after they say that, Samus flies by their ship, and they receive a transmission from her. Mission complete. So, is Prime 3 the worst game in the trilogy? Well, I think your answer to that will depend on what you like about Metroid. If you like the combat in the Prime games, then this game might be one of your favorites. But if your favorite part of a Metroid game is exploring and figuring out where to go without a lot of help, then Corruption is probably your least favorite in the trilogy. I like Prime 1 and 2 more, but I still thought Prime 3 was pretty good. In a lot of ways, this game is just as good, if not better, than the 2 previous games. But then there's things like the easier difficulty and frequent hints, which I personally don't like. If this game ever gets re-released or remastered, I hope they let you turn off the hints, or at least make it so it's not as frequent. I'm happy I finally finished Prime 3. It was the only mainline Metroid game I never finished. I'm not sure what Metroid game I'll look at next. I'm not sure if I should get into the 2D series or talk about the last 3D title, at least at the time of writing this. Well, anyway, for those who made it this far into the video, thanks for watching.